Park Jun-suk had built a life where nothing touched him. Money obeyed. Men feared. Enemies disappeared. Then his child spoke one word, and everything he controlled began to slip. Park Jun-suk ruled from rooms sealed with silence. Private hospitals. Guarded corridors. Doctors who chose their words carefully. In his world, problems were solved with resources, and outcomes were guaranteed by power. There was only one thing his money and fear had never fixed. His daughter Park Seo had never spoken. Specialists came and went. Tests returned clean. Time passed. The silence remained. Jun-suk told himself it was temporary, manageable. Just another delay he could outwait. He stood close enough to protect her, yet far enough to believe distance was love. In the background, a quiet black waitress moved through the room. She wasn't important. She wasn't family. She was hired for patience, not presence. She spoke softly, stayed consistent, and asked for nothing. The room was calm the morning it happened. Doctors watched. Guards stood still. Jun-suk waited, already deciding what he would do next if the silence continued. Then Seo lifted her head. Everyone expected the same word. She didn't look at her father. She looked past him and spoke. "Mama." The room froze. Not because a child had finally spoken, but because Park Jun-suk realized in that instant that power had never been what made his daughter feel safe. And the world had just witnessed it. From that moment on, nothing in his empire would remain untouched. Park Jun-suk had learned early that the most effective form of violence was silence. He built his empire without spectacle. No shouting. No public executions. Just decisions made behind closed doors and carried out with quiet precision. Men disappeared, contracts shifted, entire neighborhoods changed ownership, and no one ever traced the movement back to him. Fear followed his name not because of what he did, but because of how little anyone ever saw. In Seoul's underworld, people didn't say he was cruel. They said he was untouchable. His mornings began the same way every day. A secure residence overlooking the river. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A city that bent itself around his influence without ever seeing his face. Reports arrived neatly organized. Threats were filtered out before they reached him. Loyalty was measured, audited, enforced. Nothing surprised him anymore. That was how he liked it. The men who worked for him kept their distance. Even those who had known him for years spoke carefully, as if volume alone could trigger consequences. Jun-suk never raised his voice. He never needed to. The calm with which he delivered instructions carried more weight than rage ever could. Power, he believed, was not dominance. It was restraint. And restraint required distance. He applied that rule to everything, including himself. There were no photographs of him smiling. No old friends who visited unannounced. No one who could say they truly knew him. Relationships were liabilities. Attachments were weaknesses his enemies searched for relentlessly. So he lived alone inside the fortress he had built, convincing himself that solitude was proof of strength. The only exception to that rule existed down a quiet hallway, past two guards who bowed without meeting his eyes. Park Seo's room was smaller than the rest of the residence. Not because he spared expense, but because he wanted it controlled. Familiar. Soft light filtered through sheer curtains. Toys were arranged neatly, untouched unless someone else moved them. Every detail had been selected by specialists who promised normalcy if the environment remained consistent. So sat on the floor, stacking wooden blocks with careful concentration. Jun-suk stopped just inside the doorway. He never announced himself. He never interrupted her. He stood where she could see him if she looked up, but far enough away to avoid overwhelming her. That was what the doctors had advised. Presence without pressure. Love without demand. He watched her small hands move with quiet purpose. She didn't rush. She didn't react to the sound of his breathing or the guards shifting behind him. She existed in a world untouched by the fear that followed her father everywhere else. He told himself that was a victory. "You're doing well," he said softly, though he knew she wouldn't respond. Kyo did not look up. The silence between them was familiar now. Heavy but controlled. Like everything else in his life. Jun-suk had long stopped asking himself why she didn't speak. The tests were clear. The specialists had no answers. Some said time. Others said patience. A few suggested love, spoken aloud often enough, might reach her when nothing else could. He dismissed those last ones quickly. Love was not something you forced into words. From the corner of the room, the waitress knelt quietly, wiping a small spill from the floor. She moved with the kind of care that came from habit, not instruction. She didn't look at Jun-suk unless spoken to. She didn't hover. She didn't intrude. She was effective. Invisible. That was why he had approved her. Jun-suk turned to leave after a few minutes, as he always did. Lingering invited questions he refused to answer. Before stepping out, he glanced back once more. Soa had finished her tower. She studied it, then gently pressed one block into place at the top. It wobbled. She steadied it with one finger. Her lips parted, as if she were considering something. His breath caught for half a second, then settled. Nothing happened. He told himself he felt nothing as he walked away. But the truth followed him down the corridor, through the armored doors, and back into the rooms where men trembled when he spoke. For all his reach, all his control, all the enemies who feared his name, there was one place in his empire where his power had never entered. And for the first time, Park Jun-suk began to wonder whether being untouchable had cost him more than he was willing to admit. Seoa's silence had become a fact of life long before it became a concern. In the beginning, Park Jun-suk had waited the way powerful men always did, with confidence. Children developed at different speeds, the doctor said. Some spoke early. Some waited. There was no urgency, no alarm. Just time. Time he believed always bent in his favor. But months passed. And more. Words never came. The first specialist was flown in quietly, escorted through private entrances, paid enough not to ask unnecessary questions. He ran his tests, reviewed footage, observed Seoa from a careful distance. His conclusion was measured, cautious, almost hopeful. "There's no physical issue," he said. "Her hearing is fine. Her comprehension appears intact." Jun-suk had nodded, already dismissing the problem as temporary. The second doctor was less optimistic. The third avoided certainty altogether. They spoke in possibilities and probabilities, in phrases that offered no leverage. Developmental delay. Selective mutism. Emotional withdrawal. Each term sounded like a challenge his resources should have been able to crush. He threw money at it anyway. New environments were designed. New routines enforced. Specialists rotated in shifts so Soa would never be overwhelmed. Every variable was adjusted, measured, controlled. Her life became a carefully managed experiment, built on the assumption that the right conditions would eventually produce the desired result. Still she did not speak. Soa understood more than anyone expected. That became clear early on. She followed instructions, recognized faces, reacted to tone. When spoken to gently, she listened. When voices grew sharp, her shoulders tensed, her hands curled inward, as if preparing for something unseen. Jun-suk noticed that reaction and made a quiet decision. No one raised their voice around her again. Fear was removed from her world as completely as it could be, except for him. He was aware of it, though he never said it aloud. The way her eyes drifted past him instead of settling. The way her body stilled when he entered the room. She did not cry. She did not recoil. But she did not reach for him either. The doctors called it sensitivity. Jun-suk called it caution. He tried presence. Sitting closer. Speaking softly. Reading to her in a low, steady voice late at night when the house was quiet and the city outside slept. He told her stories she was too young to understand and truths he never planned to say aloud. "I built this for you," he said once, not expecting an answer. "Everything you'll ever need is already waiting." Kyo listened. Her dark eyes followed his mouth as he spoke. She blinked slowly, absorbing sound without returning it. The silence remained intact. At some point, Jun-suk stopped asking when she would speak and began asking why she didn't need to. Seowa communicated in other ways. She placed objects carefully where she wanted them. She tugged gently at sleeves when she needed help. She gravitated toward warmth, sunlit corners, soft fabrics, quiet people. She avoided sudden movement, loud footsteps, doors that closed too hard. She avoided him without meaning to. That truth sat heavier than any threat ever had. The waitress noticed these things before anyone else did. Jun-suk watched her from a distance as she moved through Seowa's days without instruction or urgency. She didn't try to make the child speak. She didn't fill the silence with questions. She simply existed within it, offering steady presence where others offered solutions. When Seowa stacked her blocks, the waitress sat nearby. When she refused food, the waitress waited, then tried again later without comment. When Seowa woke from restless sleep, it was the waitress's voice, low, even unafraid, that soothed her back into rest. Jun-suk told himself this was coincidence. Comfort was replaceable. Staff could be rotated. Attachments could be managed. But Seowa's behavior contradicted him. She lingered near the waitress, watched her closely, mimicked her movements in small unconscious ways. When frightened by an unfamiliar face or sound, her first instinct was not to look for her father. It was to turn toward the woman who spoke softly and stayed. Power could command obedience, could not command trust. That realization crept in slowly, unwelcome and persistent. Jun-suk had built his life on the belief that safety was something you enforced, something you guaranteed through strength and consequence. Yet here was his daughter, untouched by threats, responding only to gentleness he had never learned to offer. Fo did not speak because she did not need to. She had found another language, one built on presence, patience, and quiet care. And for the first time, Park Jun-suk began to understand the limits of the power that had defined him. No amount of fear could teach a child to feel safe. No empire could force a voice to emerge. And no enemy had ever made him feel as helpless as the silence of his own daughter. She arrived without ceremony, the way people meant to stay often do. Park Jun-suk approved her file in less than a minute. No criminal history. No affiliations. A background built from ordinary work. Late shifts, modest pay. No gaps that raised questions. She had applied through an agency that specialized in discretion, and her references described her with the same word repeated in different ways. Patient. That was all Jun-suk needed. From the beginning, she understood the rules without being told. She spoke only when necessary. She never lingered in doorways. She never asked personal questions. When guards watched her, she did not flinch. When Jun-suk passed her in the hallway, she lowered her gaze. Not out of fear but respect. She did her job and nothing more. At least that was what he believed. Fo noticed her immediately. Not with excitement. Not with curiosity. With recognition. The child watched the waitress the way some people watched the weather. Quietly, attentively, without expectation. When the woman entered a room, Seowa's shoulders eased. When she sat nearby, Seowa shifted closer without looking up. No one instructed her to do so. It was instinctive, as if some unspoken balance had been restored. The waitress did not reach for the child. She sat on the floor instead. That small decision went unnoticed by everyone except Seowa. When the girl stacked her wooden blocks, the waitress mirrored the rhythm. Slow hands. No urgency. If a tower fell, she didn't rush to fix it. She waited. If Seowa pushed a block toward her, she accepted it without comment and placed it down carefully, as if it mattered. She spoke rarely. When she did, her voice never rose above calm. She named colors. Counted softly. Sometimes she hummed. Not a song Seowa might recognize. Just a low, steady sound that filled the silence without demanding anything from it. Jun-suk observed all of this from a distance. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence. Children responded to consistency, the doctors said. Familiar routines. Predictable behavior. meant nothing. But days passed, then weeks, and the pattern remained. Soa followed the waitress with her eyes even when engaged in play. She waited for her before eating. When startled by a loud noise or sudden movement, she did not cry. She turned, always, to where the waitress stood. The guards noticed it too, though none of them spoke about it. Jun-suk felt it before he understood it. An unfamiliar tension settled in his chest when he saw his daughter reach for someone else's sleeve. It wasn't anger. It wasn't jealousy. It was something quieter and far more dangerous. Irrelevance. The waitress never claimed space. She never corrected Soa sharply. She never tried to guide her hands or shape her behavior. When Soa withdrew, the woman stayed nearby without hovering. When Soa engaged, she responded fully without distraction. She did not try to be needed. And somehow that made her indispensable. One afternoon, Jun-suk paused outside Seo's room longer than usual. The door was ajar. The light inside was warm. He watched as the waitress sat cross-legged on the floor, hands resting loosely in her lap. Soa approached her slowly, holding a book upside down. The waitress smiled, not wide, not encouraging, just enough to acknowledge the offering. Soa placed the book in her lap. "Thank you," the woman said softly. She didn't correct the orientation. She didn't rush to read. She waited until Soa leaned closer, then turned the book the right way, one gentle movement at a time. Soa watched. Her fingers brushed the page. She stayed. Jun-suk stepped away before he could be seen. That night, he reviewed the waitress's file again. Looked for something he had missed. Some reason for this quiet influence. Hidden agenda. A vulnerability he could identify and control. There was nothing. She was simply present. And presence, he was beginning to realize, was something his world had never taught him to value. The waitress stayed late when Soa refused to sleep. Stayed quiet when the child turned away. Stayed steady when others rotated out, frustrated by lack of progress. She never once asked when her shift would end. Never once implied she was owed recognition. She stayed because Soa needed her. That was it. Jun-suk had spent his life ensuring people stayed out of obligation, fear, or profit. Watching this woman remain without any of those unsettled him more than any threat ever had. For the first time he understood something essential. Strength did not always announce itself. Sometimes it knelt on the floor, waited patiently, and chose not to leave. And somewhere in that quiet space, Park Seo had found something her father, for all his power, had never known how to give. Not protection. Peace. The room was prepared the way everything around Park Jun-suk was prepared. With intention. Soft light. Neutral colors. Familiar faces positioned at careful distances. 2 doctors stood near the window, their voices lowered, their movements deliberate. A guard waited outside the door, far enough not to intrude. The air itself felt restrained, as if sound had been instructed to behave. Tho sat at the small table in the center of the room, her feet not quite touching the floor. Wooden blocks were arranged in neat rows before her. She tapped one against another, listening to the sound it made, absorbed in the small certainty of cause and effect. Jun-suk stood near the wall, hands folded behind his back. He told himself this was routine. Another observation. Another moment that would pass quietly, unchanged. He had learned not to expect more. Expectation invited disappointment, and disappointment was a weakness he could not afford. The waitress knelt a few feet away, close enough to be seen, far enough not to crowd. She had not been instructed to be there. She simply was. Her posture was relaxed, her attention steady, her presence unforced. The doctor cleared his throat softly. "We'll just observe for a few minutes." Jun-suk nodded without turning. Minutes passed. Soa stacked her blocks carefully, aligning edges, adjusting when something felt off. When the tower reached a certain height, she paused. Her fingers hovered, uncertain. The room waited with her. The block slipped. It fell sideways, knocking the rest into a soft clatter on the table. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Kyo froze. Her shoulders tightened. Her hands curled inward. Her eyes flicked briefly toward her father, then away. She pushed back slightly in her chair, breath shallow, as if bracing for something that never came. Before anyone else could move, the waitress shifted closer. Not fast. Not urgently. She sat down on the floor beside the table, level with Seoul's eyes. She didn't touch the blocks. Didn't speak right away. She simply placed her hands flat on the floor, grounding herself there. "It's okay," she said quietly. Not reassurance, just fact. Seoul's gaze locked onto her. The tension in the room thickened. The doctors exchanged a glance but said nothing. Jun-suk felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not hope exactly. More like awareness. As if the space had subtly reoriented itself around the two of them. Kyo picked up one block. Then another. She stacked them again, slower this time. When the tower leaned, she hesitated, lips parting slightly as if testing the shape of something new. Jun-suk leaned forward without realizing it. The room held its breath. Kyo looked at the waitress. Not past her. Not through her. Her mouth opened again. A small sound escaped. Not a word, barely even a syllable. It caught and dissolved into silence. No one moved. The waitress didn't react. She didn't encourage. She didn't smile. She stayed exactly as she was, eyes warm, expression open, waiting without expectation. Kyo tried again. The sound was fragile, unsteady, like something pulled from deep inside without knowing if it would survive the journey out. Jun-suk's heart began to pound. The doctor took a half step forward, then stopped himself. Kyo swallowed. Her fingers tightened around the block. She glanced briefly at her father, then turned back decisively to the woman on the floor. "Mama." The word landed softly. No echo. No drama. And yet the room stopped breathing. For a split second, Jun-suk didn't understand what had happened. His mind searched for context, for correction. He waited for someone to explain, to reinterpret, to say this wasn't what it sounded like. No one did. The doctor's pen slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a dull click. The sound seemed impossibly loud. One of the guards turned his head, then quickly looked away, as if he had witnessed something he was not meant to see. The waitress didn't move. Her eyes widened just slightly, not in shock but recognition. Her breath caught then steadied. She didn't reach for Seoul. She didn't repeat the word. She simply held the child's gaze, tears gathering without falling. "Yes," she whispered, barely audible. "I'm here." Seoul's shoulders relaxed. She leaned forward, resting her forehead briefly against the woman's arm. Something inside Park Jun-suk fractured. Not loudly, not completely, just enough to let something through. He had imagined this moment countless times. His daughter's first word. He had assumed it would be his name, spoken carefully, formally, as everything in his life was. He had believed it would affirm his role, his presence, his protection. Instead, it exposed the truth he had refused to see. Kyo had spoken because she felt safe. And safety in that moment did not belong to him. Jun-suk took a slow step forward, then stopped. The space between them felt suddenly immense, charged with a consequence he could not undo. The world he controlled so carefully had just shifted. And every man in the room knew it. Because power had not spoken that day. Love had. And Park Jun-suk would never be able to pretend otherwise again. The word did not fade when the room emptied. It followed Park Jun-suk down the corridor, through the doors that sealed behind him, into the spaces where silence usually restored order. He walked with measured steps, his posture unchanged, his expression controlled. Anyone watching would have seen the same man they always had. Composed, unshaken, untouchable. Inside something had shifted. "Mama." The sound replayed itself with quiet persistence, stripped of context, stripped of witnesses. Just the word and what it meant. Not confusion. Not imitation. Jun-suk had heard his name spoken in countless ways. Whispered in fear. shouted in loyalty, spoken carefully by men who weighed every syllable. He had built a reputation powerful enough to shape behavior without presence. But his daughter had not reached for that power. She had reached for comfort. He stopped in his study, standing alone before the city spread out below him. The glass reflected his image faintly, a man in a tailored suit, shoulders squared, face unreadable. He searched his own reflection for something familiar and found only distance. He had imagined this moment before. In those rare, unguarded hours when sleep wouldn't come. He had pictured Seoul's first word as a kind of arrival. Proof that patience and protection had worked. Confirmation that his way, quiet, controlled, distant, had been enough. It hadn't even been close. The doctor's voices echoed back to him now, reshaped by understanding, sensitivity, trust, emotional safety. Terms he had dismissed as vague, unmeasurable. Things without leverage. Things he had never learned to offer. He thought of the way Seoul's eyes had flicked toward him before turning away. The brief check-in. The calculation even at her age. He had been present. He had been near. But he had not been chosen. The realization carried no anger. No resentment toward the waitress. Only a hollow recognition that his daughter had learned something essential without him. She had learned where safety lived. In the hours that followed, the household adjusted around the unspoken change. Orders were given quietly. Security was tightened without explanation. Conversations softened around Seoul's room. The waitress was not dismissed. She was not questioned. She was simply left where she was. Jun-suk did not summon her. He knew that if he did, the balance would break. Instead, he watched from a distance as Seoul sought her out more openly now. The hesitation was gone. The small, careful pauses replaced by confidence. She tugged at the woman's sleeve without apology, leaned into her side, repeated the word once, softly, as if confirming it still belonged to her. "Mama." Each repetition landed with quiet force. The waitress never corrected her. She never encouraged it either. She simply accepted it the way she accepted everything Seoul offered, with calm acknowledgement and steady presence. When others were nearby, she remained careful, respectful. She did not cross lines she had not been invited to cross. Jun-suk wondered when he had last been invited anywhere. That night, he stood outside Seoul's door longer than usual. The light inside was dim. The city beyond the window glowed faintly. He could hear the murmur of the waitress's voice, low and even, speaking about nothing important at all. He responded, not with words but with small sounds. Soft breath. A hum that mirrored the rhythm of the voice beside her. Jun-suk raised his hand once, intending to knock. He let it fall. For the first time, he understood that forcing himself into that space would only confirm what he had already lost. Love could not be demanded. Trust could not be ordered into existence. He had built an empire on obedience. Fatherhood, it seemed, required something else entirely. The word appa had not been rejected. It simply hadn't been earned. That truth settled into him slowly, painfully, stripping away excuses he had carried for years. He had told himself distance was protection, that absence was sacrifice, that providing everything meant being everything. Seoul had answered that belief with one word. Not his. Jun-suk returned to the window, watching the city that bent to his influence without resistance. For the first time it felt smaller than the room behind him. Smaller than the quiet bond forming beyond his reach. He was not angry. He was exposed. And in that exposure, something unfamiliar began to take shape. Not regret, not shame, but responsibility. If his daughter had found safety elsewhere, then the question was no longer who she loved. It was whether he was willing to change enough to deserve being loved back. For a man no one touched, that was the most dangerous realization of all. News traveled differently in Park Jun-suk's world. It didn't move through headlines or messages. Surfaced in pauses, in glances held a fraction too long. In the way conversations stopped when he entered rooms that never used to fall silent. He felt it before he could name it. The day after Seo spoke, Jun-suk sat at the head of a long conference table while reports were delivered with their usual efficiency. Territory updates, financial flows. A disrupted shipment handled quietly overnight. Everything was intact, profitable, controlled. Yet something underneath had shifted. His lieutenant, Kong, finished speaking and hesitated. Barely noticeable but wrong. Another man avoided eye contact altogether. A third checked his phone twice, then slipped it face down onto the table, as if hiding the screen would erase what he had read. Jun-suk said nothing. Silence had always corrected behavior better than confrontation. Still, the room felt crowded with unspoken things. Later that afternoon, a call came in through a line few people knew existed. The voice on the other end was calm, almost amused. "I heard congratulations are in order." Jun-suk did not respond. The man chuckled softly. "First words are important, they say." The pause that followed was heavy enough to crack stone. Jun-suk ended the call without a word. He stood by the window afterward, gaze fixed on the city, jaw tight. The fact was undeniable now. What had happened in that room had not stayed there. It had leaked, not through betrayal but through observation. Doctors spoke. Staff noticed. Men who survived by reading power sensed imbalance the way animals sense storms. And predators paid attention to storms. By evening the subtle tests began. A delayed shipment that should not have been delayed. A supplier who suddenly requested renegotiation. A small crew crossing a boundary they had avoided for years, retreating only after being reminded. Firmly, where the lines still stood. But lines were only respected when they were believed to be enforced without hesitation. Jun-suk reviewed footage late into the night. Surveillance feeds. Internal logs. He watched faces more than actions. Searched for tells. For doubt. For the precise moment loyalty began to weigh risk against reward. He saw it then, in a way he never had before. Not rebellion. Calculation. Men who once assumed he was unreachable were reassessing. Not because he had grown weak, but because he had been seen reacting to something that wasn't power. Emotion was a language everyone understood. The waitress's presence became a variable in conversations that never named her directly. The household. The child's routine. New considerations. Each phrase carried weight. Each implied a question that would soon demand an answer. Jun-suk tightened security without announcement. Routes were changed. Information access narrowed. No one was dismissed yet. Premature punishment invited panic. And panic bred mistakes. But he could feel the clock beginning to move. That night, he stood once more outside Seo's room. The door was closed this time. From inside came the soft cadence of a familiar voice reading aloud. Not instructing. Not performing. Just being. Jun-suk rested his hand against the wall, steadying himself. For the first time he saw the situation clearly. His daughter was not the weakness. The weakness was that others believed she could be used as one. And belief alone was enough to start wars. He returned to his study and made a call of his own. "Double the perimeter," he said calmly. "No visible changes. I want eyes everywhere, especially where they think I'm not looking." "Yes, sir." Another call followed. Then another. Not threats. Not orders soaked in blood. Preparations. Quiet adjustments. The kind that preceded decisive action. Still the unease remained. Because this time, the stakes were not territory or reputation. This time the consequences had a face. Someone out there was already imagining leverage. Already measuring distances. Already deciding how far they could push before the man no one touched proved whether that was still true. Jun-suk looked at his hands, steady and familiar, and acknowledged a truth he could no longer avoid. His enemies had seen something real. And once weakness had a witness, it demanded a response. Not louder, not crueler, but absolute. Whatever came next, It would not be handled the way things had been before. Because this time, Park Jun-suk was not protecting an empire. He was protecting a child who had learned how to speak. And anyone who mistook that for vulnerability was about to learn just how dangerous change could be. Park Jun-suk had faced interrogations without flinching. He had stood across from men who wanted him dead, listened to threats spoken inches from his face, and never once felt the need to explain himself. Explanation was weakness. Apology was surrender. In his world you acted or you were acted upon. But the night after the calls, after the subtle tests and the quiet tightening of lines, he found himself sitting alone in a room with no enemies at all. Just a truth he could no longer outrun. Cho was asleep. The house had settled into its late-hour stillness, the kind that usually brought him clarity. Tonight, it only magnified the noise in his head. He sat in a low chair near the window, jacket folded neatly beside him, city lights blinking below like distant signals he could no longer fully interpret. For the first time, he replayed the moment without defenses. Not strategically. Not emotionally contained. Honestly. Seoa's brief glance toward him before she turned away. The calculation in her small pause. The certainty with which she chose someone else. He had told himself he was protecting her by staying distant. That fear could be kept outside her world if he kept himself partially outside it too. He had convinced himself that love, spoken sparingly, meant more when it finally arrived. But Seo had not been waiting. She had been adapting. The realization struck harder than any threat ever had. His absence had not preserved her innocence. It had taught her where not to look. His silence had not given her space. It had given her uncertainty. He had been there. But he had not been with her. Jun-suk closed his eyes, something he rarely did while awake. Images surfaced uninvited. Seo flinching at raised voices. Her instinctive turn toward the waitress. The way she relaxed only when expectation disappeared. He understood it now. Fear was his native language. Of course his daughter had learned a different one. The waitress had not replaced him. She had filled a void he refused to acknowledge. A soft knock sounded at the door. Jun-suk opened his eyes. "Come in." The waitress stepped inside cautiously, hands folded, posture respectful. She stopped a few feet away, uncertainty flickering across her face. Not fear, but awareness of the imbalance between them. "I thought you should know," she said gently. Seo woke briefly. "She's sleeping again." "Thank you," he replied. The words felt insufficient, but he let them stand. She hesitated, then spoke again. She was calm. He nodded. "She usually is." The silence that followed was different from the ones he was used to. It wasn't controlled. It wasn't imposed. It simply existed, asking to be acknowledged. "She trusts you," he said at last. The waitress did not deny it. She also did not accept it with pride. "She trusts consistency," she said carefully. "And patience." Jun-suk studied her face. Not for weakness, not for motive. For understanding. And I failed to give her that. The admission surprised them both. The waitress lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond. "I thought distance was protection," he continued. His voice steady but quieter than usual. "I thought fear could be kept outside if I carried it alone." He paused, choosing the next words without strategy. "I was wrong." The room seemed to exhale. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not justify himself. He simply let the truth sit between them, exposed and unarmed. "I don't want her to feel like she has to choose safety away from me," he said. "But I don't know how to undo what I've taught her." The waitress looked up then, meeting his eyes for the first time since she had arrived in his household. There was no accusation there. No judgment. Only honesty. "You don't undo it," she said softly. "You change what comes next." Something in his chest tightened. Not painfully but decisively. "I don't know how to be gentle," he admitted. "You don't have to be," she replied. "You just have to stay." The simplicity of it unsettled him. No distance disguised as sacrifice. No authority mistaken for presence. Just staying, even when nothing was demanded in return. "I won't ask you to leave," he said after a moment. "And I won't ask you to step back." The waitress inclined her head slightly. "I'm here for her." "I know," he said. Then more quietly. "And that's why I trust you." When she left, Jun-suk remained where he was, the city still glowing beyond the glass. He felt no relief, no sudden clarity. But he felt something else. Exposure. Not the kind that invited attack, but the kind that made transformation unavoidable. For the first time, he did not see his failure as something to hide or correct through force. He saw it as a responsibility. Kyo would not remember the empire he built. She would remember who stayed when she needed them. And Park Jun-suk, the man no one touched, finally understood that being a father meant allowing himself to be seen, unfinished, uncertain, and willing to change. That realization did not weaken him. It stripped him down to something far more dangerous. A man with something real to lose, and the courage to become someone worthy of keeping it. The change did not announce itself. There were no dramatic orders, no sudden displays meant to reassure the men who watched Park Jun-suk for signs of weakness. His voice did not grow louder. His posture did not harden. If anything, the shift was quieter than everything that came before it. And far more deliberate. The first thing he changed was proximity. He began entering Seoul's room without stopping at the doorway. No more observing from a distance, measuring the impact of his presence like a threat assessment. He crossed the space slowly, sat on the floor where she played, and stayed there even when she did not look up. First she ignored him. That hurt more than he expected. He did not correct it. He did not retreat. He placed a block beside her tower and waited. When it fell, he did not reach to fix it. He simply watched her rebuild, learning the rhythm of her silence instead of trying to break it. The waitress noticed. She said nothing. That was how Jun-suk knew he was doing something right. Power he was learning did not need to be visible to be real. It did not need to dominate every space it entered. Sometimes it simply needed to remain steady enough to be trusted. The second thing he changed was language. He stopped giving instructions about Seoul's care as commands and began giving them as commitments. Schedules were adjusted not for efficiency, but for comfort. Security routes were redesigned so Seoul would not see unfamiliar faces without warning. Voices were lowered not because he demanded it but because he modeled it. Men who had once enforced fear now enforced gentleness. And that frightened them more than any threat ever had. Because it required restraint without reward. One afternoon So reached for him for the first time. It was not dramatic. No sudden cry. No reaching arms. She simply placed her small hand on his sleeve as she passed him, steadying herself as if he were a piece of furniture she had decided was safe enough to touch. Jun-suk did not move. He breathed. When her hand fell away, he remained where he was, pulse pounding, resisting the instinct to seize the moment and turn it into proof of progress. Love, he reminded himself, was not a victory to be claimed. It was something to be protected. The real test came when the pressure returned. A rival syndicate pushed harder this time. A border crossing disrupted. A warning delivered through intermediaries who smiled too easily. The message beneath it all was clear. "See you now." Jun-suk listened. Then he responded, not with spectacle but precision. Routes were closed silently. Finances redirected. Influence applied where fear once lived. The retaliation was swift, bloodless, and absolute. No one traced it back to Seoul. No one even tried. Because the message he sent was not one of rage. It was one of resolve. He did not become softer. He became focused. The waitress watched him differently now. Not warily, but with something like cautious respect. She saw the way he positioned himself between Seoul and unfamiliar spaces. The way his voice softened without hesitation when speaking to her. The way he never corrected her when she reached for the woman, and still allowed himself to remain present beside them both. One evening, as Seoul drifted toward sleep, Jun-suk stayed by her bed longer than usual. The city outside glowed dimly. The house was quiet. Soa stirred, eyes half open. She looked at him. Just him. No calculation. No hesitation. She did not speak. But she did not turn away either. Jun-suk felt something settle into place. Something that did not need words to exist. He understood now that fear had always been his shield, but it had also been his barrier. It had kept enemies at bay while keeping his daughter just as far away. Protection through love was slower, riskier. It required patience and presence instead of force. But it built something fear never could. Trust. Jun-suk straightened as he stood, adjusting the blanket around So with careful hands. As he left the room, he realized something profound. He was no longer protecting his child from the world by standing apart from her. He was protecting her by standing with her. And anyone who mistook that choice for weakness would soon learn what real power looked like when it was rewritten, not as domination but as devotion. Morning arrived quietly. The city below Park Jun-suk's residence moved the way it always had. Traffic flowing, buildings catching light, people unaware of the lines of influence that once bent everything in his favor. He stood by the window for a long moment, jacket draped over the chair behind him, hands resting loosely at his sides. For the first time in years, the view did not feel like proof of ownership. Felt like distance. He turned away before the thought could harden and walked down the hallway without escort. The guards watched him pass, uncertain whether to follow. He gave no signal. They remained where they were. Soa's door was open. She sat on the floor near the window, a book spread open in front of her, pages turned at random. The waitress sat nearby, reading softly, not insisting on order, letting the story exist however So wanted it to. When Jun-suk entered, neither of them startled. That, more than anything else, told him how much had changed. He lowered himself to the floor a few feet away, careful not to interrupt. He did not speak. He waited. Kyoa glanced up. Her eyes lingered on him, not briefly, not cautiously. She studied his face the way children do when they are deciding something important. Then she returned to her book, pushing it across the floor until it rested against his knee. Jun-suk's breath caught. He picked it up slowly, holding it the way he had seen the waitress do. He did not correct the page. He did not rush. He read what was there, even when it made little sense. His voice steady, unforced. Kyo leaned closer. She did not touch him, but she stayed. In that small, ordinary moment, Jun-suk felt the weight of everything he had once believed begin to dissolve. Legacy, he had thought, was something you left behind. Territory secured, enemies silenced, a name powerful enough to outlive you. But none of that mattered here. Kyo would not inherit fear. She would inherit memory. The memory of who stayed when nothing was demanded. Who listened without expecting reward. Who learned slowly and imperfectly how to be present. The waitress rose quietly after a while, giving them space without ceremony. Jun-suk noticed the absence and did not rush to fill it. He read until the book slipped from his hand and Seo's breathing softened, her head resting lightly against his arm. He did not move. Outside the room, the world still waited. Rivals still calculated. Power still required maintenance. But those things no longer defined the shape of his days. He understood now that strength was not what kept people at a distance. Strength was what allowed them to come close without fear. Later, as Soa slept, Jun-suk stood at the window again, this time inside her room. The city looked different from here. Smaller. Less demanding. He thought of the choices he had made, the ones he had yet to make, and felt no regret, only clarity. His daughter had chosen safety before she chose blood. And so he would choose differently too. He would still protect, still anticipate threats, still move with precision. But he would do it from a place that did not require him to disappear behind fear. When So woke, she would see him. Not looming. Not distant. Present. That would be the legacy he built from this day forward. Not an empire carved by silence, but a life shaped by attention, patience, and restraint. Park Jun-suk left the room quietly, closing the door behind him with care. For the first time, the man no one touched understood that being chosen was not about power. It was about becoming someone worth choosing. And that, he knew now, was the strongest position he had ever held.